Today we're unboxing an iPhone 4S that should be running its original software version, iOS 5. I picked this up on eBay for only $20, but it's definitely going to be a rescue mission because the device looked to be in pretty rough condition. Let's go ahead and get it unboxed now. And here is the iPhone. As you can tell, this device is somehow missing its home button. And aside from the pretty noticeable scratches on the display, there's also a really large chip in the glass. The stainless steel band on this iPhone looks to be surprisingly in great shape, however. The back glass here, though, has pretty major scratches. Let's see if this iPhone has any battery power to start up. And it looks like it does, and we get the old school Apple logo. Okay, nice. Well, we boot directly into the iOS 5 setup screen. I'm curious to see if this home button is somewhat functional by pressing this button. Okay, yeah, and it looks like it is. This is just so strange to see. I've never known of a home button to fall out of an iPhone. So let's go through this iOS 5 setup. I love the skeuomorphic design of this setup with the linen style background. Okay, looks like we got through activation. And there we go. This is the iOS 5 home screen. You can immediately identify this as iOS 5 with the old school YouTube app, the old school Maps icon, as well as the older settings icon. Let's jump into settings now and see which version of iOS 5 we have. Okay, looks like we have 5.1.1 here. That was the last revision of iOS 5. We can also see that we have a 16GB AT&T model here. So with this iPhone running its original software version but being in a very unfortunate condition, I would say it's a great candidate for a housing swap. And I have a couple iPhone 4S models in my collection that have been updated, so they would be great candidates to pull the housing from. And here is the iPhone 4S that we will be swapping the iOS 5 logic board into. This is one of the later base model 8GB iPhone 4S models. And as you can see, it's fully updated to iOS 9, so there's really nothing special or valuable here. As you can see though, this one is in really excellent condition. And there is definitely a home button present here. So let's go ahead and start the repair now. The process of getting the logic board swapped on this iPhone was not as hard as I thought it would be. This iPhone is pretty unique in the way that you actually do the repair from the back of the device rather than the front. So with only 2 screws, you can remove the back glass panel, while most other iPhones would require you to remove the screen to do a logic board swap. There were only around 16 screws to remove, and less than 10 connectors that were all really easily disconnected. There were a few clips and grounding pins that were a little bit fiddly though. And of course, once I got the iOS 5 logic board successfully in the new frame, I simply repeated the process and put the iOS 9 logic board in the old frame. I followed an iFixit guide to get this done, so a huge shout out to them for helping get this repair done. And the whole logic board swap process only took around an hour. And here is the finished product. This iPhone is looking absolutely incredible now. And it's made a huge transformation from what it looked like at the beginning of the video. So let's use our now fully functional home button and check out this device. The iPhone 4S was released in October 2011, and it's a very significant device for several reasons. The first of which being that this was the last iPhone to be announced while Steve Jobs was still alive. He sadly passed away just one day after this iPhone was announced. And this iPhone was also known for introducing Siri, Apple's new voice assistant. And this was one of the last iPhones where the S naming schematic really made sense, as the S in the name this time clearly stood for Siri. So let's try out the original version of Siri now. And I hope you guys don't mind, but I have a really childish question that I want to ask her. What does the fox say? And I wanted to ask Siri a funny question at first because that was really common, especially when it was first released. I remember a couple of my family members got iPhone 4S models back in 2011, and it was super fun to just joke around with Siri like this. Of course, the main purpose of Siri was to get practical things done though. Remind me to upload my video at 3 p.m. today. So as you can see, Siri just set up a reminder for me. This reminders function along with the application was actually new for iOS 5. Siri actually has a really interesting story. Prior to Apple building this feature into the iPhone 4S, it was actually a separate third-party application. Apple went on to buy that application and build the functionality in exclusively to this iPhone. And that was a bit controversial as the separate Siri application could have been downloaded on older devices like the iPhone 4. But other than having Siri and being one of the last Steve Jobs era iPhones, this iPhone really made a lot of improvements over its predecessor, the iPhone 4. It got a huge upgrade with the dual-core A5 chip, whereas the iPhone 4 had a single-core A4 chip. This A5 was clocked at around 800 megahertz and it was quoted to have 7 times faster graphics. It also brought an 8 megapixel rear-facing camera up from 5 megapixels on the iPhone 4. It could now record video at 1080p HD quality. It also was now backside illuminated, had face detection, and could capture photos 33% faster. Unfortunately, there was no upgrade to the front-facing camera. It was still the same VGA quality 0.3 megapixel camera. This iPhone had the same 3.5-inch Retina display as the iPhone 4. And this was still very revolutionary at the time as many iPhone users were using older models that had a non-Retina display. And this Retina display was just so sharp in comparison to the iPhone 3GS and older that could appear very grainy. This was the last iPhone that charged with Apple's 30-pin dock connector, as this was replaced with the Lightning connector in the 2012 iPhone 5. This iPhone also had an all-new antenna system, and that was definitely brought in to address the antenna gate concerns from the iPhone 4. There was now only one model for both CDMA and GSM carriers, whereas the previous iPhone 4 had a separate model for each of those. You could also get this iPhone 4S in a new top-tier 64GB storage configuration. The previous iPhone 4 was limited to 32 gigabytes. This iPhone launched at a price of $199 for a 16 gigabyte configuration on a typical 2-year carrier contract. It dropped in price to $99 with the release of the iPhone 5 in 2012. And it dropped in price again to free on contract with the release of the iPhone 5C and 5S in 2013. And it was discontinued altogether in late 2014 with the release of the iPhone 6. This iPhone infamously received software support all the way through iOS 9 in 2015. And I say infamously because performance on this device really began to struggle on iOS 8 and especially with iOS 9. The A5 chip and that 512 megabytes of RAM was just not enough for those versions to operate smoothly. Some users of the iPhone 4S on iOS 9 even sued Apple for that poor performance. But this iPhone really had a great reputation for most of its life, as it was a really decent upgrade over the iPhone 4 and it performed really well on iOS versions 5 through 7. So now let's talk about iOS 5 on this device specifically. iOS 5 really made a lot of important improvements that we still use in iOS today. The first of which is introducing iCloud. And iCloud kept all of your content in sync across your devices wirelessly. With iOS 4 and older, you were left constantly plugging your device into your computer to keep it in sync. This was also the first version of iOS where you were able to set up the device without a computer. In iOS 4 and prior, you were required to connect your device to iTunes to activate it. iOS 5 also introduced over-the-air updates, and it brought a huge redesign to the notification system. You now had a notification center available with just a swipe. Previously in iOS 4, this was just not available, so it was really easy to lose track of notifications if you had several pile up. It also brought non-persistent notifications with a banner that would come down from the top of your screen. Previously, all notifications would come up in the center of your screen and require dismissal. So those changes to notifications in iOS 5 made a huge difference in ease of use. This version also brought iMessage. And iMessage, of course, brought the superiority that comes with those blue message bubbles. And it was huge because it worked over Wi-Fi. That was especially huge for iPad and iPod Touch users as you could message with only an email address and Wi-Fi. It also brought really nice features like delivered and read receipts. And for the iPhone and iPad, iOS 5 now had separate applications for your music and videos, whereas previously it was just one application called iPod. This newsstand folder was new for this version. And as I mentioned earlier, this was the last iOS version to feature the built-in YouTube application and Google Maps. I also wanted to discuss a few unique things that apply to older versions of iOS. So one of which is the emoji keyboard. You used to have to go into settings to activate that. So going into general here and scrolling down to the keyboard section, you can go to international keyboards, add a new keyboard, and then find the emoji option here. So that was quite a few steps to enable that. But once you did, it was really fun to play around with the emojis. Something else I don't usually discuss is battery percentage. The process for activating that used to look like going into settings, general usage, and then activating it. So that was also a lot of steps to do something pretty basic. iOS 5 is really one of my favorite legacy iOS versions. I would say it's second only to early versions of iOS 7. Let's take a look at the default wallpaper selection here on iOS 5. So there's 27 images to choose from here. And this was the last version to have this globe option. And this was really nostalgic because this was the default wallpaper for iPhone OS 1 through 3. Of course, these water droplets that you've seen throughout the video were the default for iOS 4 and 5. But there were a lot of other really nice options to choose from. Personally, I love this peacock feather as it really shows off the quality of the Retina display. So I think I will set that for the rest of this video. So that pretty much concludes my look at this iPhone 4S running iOS 5.1.1. I had a lot of fun restoring this device. When I first saw this on eBay with no home button, I was a bit skeptical. But I knew these devices are super rare on their original version and I would not regret picking it up. Be sure to get subscribed and hit that notification bell if you want to see more legacy iOS devices on their original software. Also, if you're interested in these restoration videos, I have more of those in store as well. I'm currently working on videos restoring the original MacBook Air as well as an iPhone 7 running iOS 10. Thank you so much for watching and I'll see you guys in the next video.